first I want to just provide a conceptual framework for bringing toxicology into the green chemistry discussion, and that's why the title of this is Green Toxicology, and practical nexus towards safer, sustainable chemistries, and provide, hopefully, a reason why green toxicology is an emerging field that is hopefully essential to bringing those two together. Give a bit of history on green chemistry for those who don't know green chemistry and green toxicology. Then I'll go into a bit of the state of the art on new toxicology tools that are being developed not only at the US EPA's National Center for Computational Toxicology, but also internationally, and also provide some ideas to move forward, especially in the education arena. How do we actually bring this to the chemistry community, the chemists who are generally not instructed in the fundamentals and the principles of toxicology? So hopefully I can get through that all today. And I also want to mention that in March of 2017, there is a special edition on green toxicology scheduled for the journal Current Green Chemistry. And so those of you keep an eye out for that in that particular journal. And I am working under the assumption that everything we see, use, smell, and touch is a chemical. So, except for electromagnetic radiation, we can certainly affect not only the properties of a molecule, but also the toxicity of a molecule by changing and manipulating its structure. And there on the slide, you can is my contact information. Please feel free to contact me, email me anytime you'd like with any questions. So the disclaimer. The opinions expressed in this presentation are strictly those of the speaker, that would be me, and do not necessarily represent the views, policies, or practices of the United States Environmental Protection Agency. So these are strictly my opinions and views on things. So to get into it, a little bit of background here, a little history. On the left there, you can see a slide there. It's me downstairs in my basement last night. I have a little lab downstairs, and making up a few chemicals. I do that in my spare time. My wife there doesn't really appreciate me doing it that late at night. But the point there is that synthetic chemistry has been around for quite a while, at least since the early 1800s. And if you look at the different programs around the country, different universities, different industries, chemicals, thousands of chemicals are being made every single day in different laboratories. And the majority of those chemicals are not tested for their toxicity before they go into the marketplace, and they are certainly not tested in the design phase of these chemicals. So we need to, throughout our talk, think about and keep that in the back of our mind. And so as we see Professor Footwick there, he's making sure that we study up beforehand and identify all of the adverse effects that can affect the environment. So designing safer chemicals is a tremendously complex task. So we are moving forward with green chemistry, with computational toxicology to address those. So the old saying back in the 70s when I was a kid is better living through chemistry. And that, for the most part, is true. If you look at the medicines in the pharmaceutical industry that have been developed, they have been, for the most part, beneficial to both increasing lifespan, increasing the quality of life, making life better. But we can identify some problems like thalidomide that didn't work out so well, but generally okay. Cosmetic products, personal care products like lotions and makeup, things like that. Kevlar is a success story that was a product of innovative chemistry. Nylon, without nylon we wouldn't have parachutes or other good things. And obviously, one of my favorites is silly putty. So you can go from, compounds that are made with specific endpoints and purposes, and just to the fun stuff. But traditionally what was not looked at are environmental side effects. We're familiar with the side effects of medicines. Thalidomide that I just mentioned is what's called a teratogen. It results in birth defects. One isomer of it does, but it was put onto the market before that was discovered, and it was tragic consequences. So we know about the human side effects. A lot of times we don't think about environmental side effects. So we need to think about both of these as we're designing the next generation of chemicals. The incident in Bhopal, India in 1984, there was a release of methyl isocyanate at a Union Carbide plant in India. Methyl isocyanate is very reactive. It's used in the synthesis of the pesticide. It was released late at night in the evening when many people were sleeping. The immediate death toll was close to 2,300. And beyond that, because of the lingering effects, 8,000 people lost their lives, 5,500 injuries due to exposure to this. So this was a horribly catastrophic accident, and it didn't have to happen. And so this incident, because it was so massive, really gave rise to a different way of thinking about synthesizing chemicals and bringing in the toxicology beforehand. So just a quick overview of green chemistry for those who are, we may have one or two toxicologists on the line. So just a little history of green chemistry. The Pollution Prevention Act of 1990 really started things rolling. So it put pollution prevention at the top of a series of different options for risk reduction, and pollution prevention was the #1 goal. There was a program in existence at EPA called the Alternative Synthetic Reactions Program, already in existence. Some very forward-thinking people in that group decided that they would look at this issue in a more holistic, more encompassing way, and the idea of green chemistry was born. So green chemistry really started at EPA in the early 90s in the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics. So during that time, there were several advancements in green chemistry. In 1996, the Presidential Green Chemistry Challenge Awards were established, which provided recognition to companies who, in some cases, were already engaged in green chemistry, but it wasn't called green chemistry. It was called risk reduction, safer chemistries. It was called something different. So this was a program that really recognized companies for that, and engagement in the industrial community, academia, NGOs, and government groups really expanded. Then we saw the first Green Chemistry and Engineering Conference. 1998, the seminal book, Theory and Practice, was published, and you can see over the past 25 years that green chemistry has been around, it has really increased in its influence and its scope. So there's the formal definition out of the 1998 Theory and Practice book. The utilization of a set of principles that reduces or eliminates the use or generation of hazardous substances in the design, manufacture, and application of chemical products. It's a very comprehensive and very ambitious definition. Over the years, it's changed. It's been streamlined, benign by design is another way to look at it. Sustainable chemistry is an alternative way to think about green chemistry. But the key concept that I think and others have really focused on in that definition is the word design. Because design is an intentional act. You need to you need to begin a process, an intellectual process to design a particular product. And that involves an academic approach that was not taken, and it is difficult. So the idea of the design in the formal definition of green chemistry is key. So green chemistry is pollution prevention at the molecular level. It started out as a pollution prevention technique, and if you're looking at it in the world of EPA, we are certainly very supportive of any pollution prevention activities. And if it can be done up on the molecular level, all the better. As I said before, there are several other ways to look at it. Design for the environment, preventive, or holistic chemistry. But what green chemistry also is, it's scientifically based. It is based on the principles of chemistry. It's based on the principles of toxicology, and there is an innovative science component to it. It's not just some fad, some run-of-the-mill idea. It's economically sound. The data supporting green chemistry as an economically viable tool and an economically necessary approach is available throughout the literature. And you look at pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and Merck and Monsanto, and industrial companies like Dow and Monsanto, all have demonstrated that they save money by using green chemistry principles. If you do not have to purchase a solvent, then you've saved money. If you're not worried about disposal and waste cost, you've also saved money. And thirdly, if you have disposed of it improperly, you do not have to worry about the US EPA or state agencies finding out about it and winding up in court. So there are many advantages to green chemistry. And green chemistry is what you can do. It opens up a whole world of innovation. Generally, when you look at the regulation of chemicals, it's a list of what you cannot do. So you've got a list of forbidden chemicals. You cannot use this, you cannot use that. Green chemistry turns that on its head and says, these are the things you can do. It's a positive way of looking at chemical design. What chemistry is not. It's not a regulatory tool. There have been many attempts to use green chemistry as regulation. If you look at the A statute out in California, it's called the Green Chemistry Law, and it really is not meant to be a regulatory tool. Green chemistry is not mysterious. It uses available science and available principles in a coordinated way to design and redesign safer chemicals. Green chemistry is also not environmental chemistry. Green chemistry includes environmental chemistry and the concepts, for example, persistence, bioaccumulation, biodegradation. So it includes environmental chemistry, but it is not environmental chemistry. It is not an all or nothing proposition. If you don't meet or don't satisfy all 12 of the green chemistry principles, that doesn't mean that you haven't done green chemistry. You've improved the situation if you haven't worsened any of the other situations. So green chemistry is a philosophy. And again, as I said before, it is not a list of what you cannot do. So it's just framed a little bit differently. Now, I said that green chemistry the idea, began in the early 1990s. But the discussion of bringing synthetic chemistry and toxicology together is much older than the 1990s. Here's a quote from Alice Hamilton, who was a physician back in late 1800 and passed in 1970. So she was actually quite healthy, almost made 100 years old. But there are two quotes that are very important from a book that she produced back in 1928. So if you think about that, that's 90 years ago, almost. And what Alice Hamilton said was, and being a physician too, synthetic chemistry must have as one of its great objectives the further safeguarding of health and life in the industries into which chemistry itself has introduced new poisons. So she's understanding the connection between new poisons and synthetic chemistry and safeguarding health. Why would that be? Because 1928 was right around 9 years after World War I. And World War I saw synthetic chemistry devising some of the most vile compounds known. Nerve gases, nitrogen mustards, things that were used in warfare. Alice was quite acutely aware of this, and she made that connection back in 1928. And then she went on and she said, toxicology must join with chemistry in testing the new compounds, which chemistry introduces into industry. So she made the connection back then that we need chemistry and toxicology to work together to make sure that we test these new compounds. That did happen later on, but unfortunately, the testing didn't occur until the horse was out of the barn. Much of the testing for the compounds in commerce doesn't occur until they've been used for years and years. But later on, I'll get to some of the ways that EPA and others have addressed this temporal issue. So again, just to go back to nature, as a synthetic community, we're pretty far behind nature. Nature has been and always will be the molecular design extraordinaire. Examples are fibers, wood, cotton, silk, etc. Fragrances, things that smell nice, things that smell pretty nasty. Natural dyes, medicinal plants that are found in flowers, leaves, seeds. Shellac is found, is made by insects. It's actually quite good for you. You can actually eat shellac. But also nature has very clever ways of making some of the most toxic chemicals known. Biological toxins, snakes, other sea creatures, anemones, insects and plants produce some of the most toxic compounds known. And then, nature makes just regular natural gas, crude oil, things like that. One thing to remember down the bottom, natural does not mean non-toxic, and synthetic, man-made, does not always mean hazardous. We need to have it, as toxicologists, as chemists working together, what we need to have as our central rallying cry is the structure-hazard relationship. It doesn't matter where the compound comes from. So now enter the toxicologist. For those of you who don't know, toxicology is the study of adverse effects on living systems, and they can be biological, chemical, or radiological toxicants. Again, one of the issues are chemists are not trained in toxicology, but also toxicologists are not trained in chemistry. So toxicologists must engage with the chemist at the molecular design stage. So again, we're getting back to the temporal issue. The way we've been doing things, synthesizing compounds, putting them into commerce, and then finding out later on that they're toxic, is not the way to go. You see at the bottom left, and this is kind of a progression. Paracelsus, or one of his siblings, they're thinking about making a new compound. Well, there's something called Tox 21, which I will describe a little bit later, but it's 21st century toxicology. And if you see on the right-hand side, that is a robot. Robots are now being used for analyzing compounds for approximately 700 different endpoints every day. So thousands, tens of thousands of assays are being done every day using robotics under the Tox21 program. So we've gone from making a single compound, testing a single compound that may take years to generate data to make a decision, and now we're generating tens of thousands of data points every day. So what is green toxicology, and what's the point? The definition of green toxicology is the application of the principles of toxicology to design safer, sustainable products and processes. And so we're going from, we're making the connection between green chemistry and toxicology. And so it is an emerging field of study that takes these. You can see on the left there is Asclepius, who was who's considered the father of modern toxicology, and we're going from traditional toxicology to 21st century toxicology. And here's where the nexus is between toxicology and chemistry. Underlying everything, whether it's a molecular reaction in a test tube or a round bottom flask, or whether it's a chemical reaction in a biological system, all of the reactions follow the fundamental rules of chemistry. So physical chemical properties, the way chemicals behave, is central to understanding how they work in biological systems. So 21st century toxicology, which was a program started with 4 government agencies, the FDA, the NTP, EPA, which is the group that I work with, and also the National Center for Translational Science. So all working to use computational methods, using in vitro screening, using quantitative structure-activity relationships. That's what QSAR is. High throughput screening, in silico computer methods, and also combining that with in vivo studies, so traditional studies in rats, in dogs, in mice, and putting all these together at the early stages of design to hopefully articulate design guidelines. So providing design guidelines to make safer chemicals to synthetic chemists. So getting back to the chemists who are on the call, the whole idea of what we're trying to do here is reduce risk. And risk is a product of hazard, intrinsic hazard, and exposure. If you have a jar of mercury, which is intrinsically very toxic, but there is no exposure, the risk is 0. So every compound has some intrinsic hazard, but if there is no exposure, then the risk itself is 0. So that's what we're always looking at. And when we talk about hazard, we're not just talking about toxicological hazards, we're talking about physical hazards. And as chemists, physical hazards are, I believe, much more familiar because they're more exuberant. So explosions and fire, all the good stuff that make you become a chemist, those are the physical hazards. Toxicological are more subtle. I remember one of my chemistry professors saying to me, if you smell burnt almonds, make sure to leave the lab very quickly, because burnt almonds means that cyanide has been released in some synthetic pathway. Well, personally, I had never smelled burnt almonds, and I had absolutely no idea what it would smell like, but I heeded that, and I was constantly waiting to smell burnt almonds. So anyway, toxicological hazards are more subtle, and also global hazards we need to think about, like global warming, like compounds that contribute to climate change. Traditionally, in regulatory situations, Risk reduction has focused on the exposure, controlling the exposure. So putting on gloves, putting on safety glasses, putting on scrubbers for stack emissions. But in each case, it will fail. Well, we need to reduce intrinsic risk. And so the idea of toxic and non-toxic, what does actually non-toxic mean? If you look at the original definition that is used by most toxicologists, it is solidosis facit venenum, or the dose makes the poison. This was articulated by Paracelsus. WBW means way back when. So back in the 1500s, Paracelsus identified that the higher the dose, the more toxic something will be. So if everything is a poison at some dose, the opposite is true as well. Everything is non-toxic at a low enough dose. So over the years, we've modified that to include temporal exposures, so the timing is important, the routes of exposure are important, but as we're moving into the 21st century toxicology, we're looking at toxicology a little bit more deeply. So we understand that the dose is the primary factor. The chemical structure determines where and how that chemical gets to its site of action. To get to the site of action, it is also influenced by what is called toxicokinetics. And that is usually represented by the acronym ADME: absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. So a compound that is either given as an intravenous dose or is inhaled may not be the exact same compound that reaches the site of action because of the toxicokinetics. And also, once the compound reaches the site of action, toxicodynamics, what it does when it reaches a receptor, is also important. And as I said, route of exposure is very important. And also other things like exposures at very young ages, for very old or older individuals, also have an influence on toxicity. So when we say something is not toxic or something is toxic, it really isn't that simple. There are no bright lines in toxicology. Bringing in the chemist again, the role of chemistry in safer molecular design. This is a pie chart done by Rendick et al. And that shows a general pie chart of the reaction types that are involved in bioactivation. And bioactivation is taking a compound that you may be exposed to or given as a drug that is not active as given. It needs to be metabolized, bioactivated to be active. A good example is aspirin. Acetyl salicylic acid needs to be metabolized to salicylic acid to be functional. So if the point of this slide is, if you look at those reactions, epoxidation, diol and epoxide formation, nitro reduction, quinone formation, all of these reactions are known to chemists. And so if chemists think, well, where do I fit in this whole discussion of toxicology? Right here. This is a great place to start, because if you can look at a molecule and look at the structure and say, well, this needs to be epoxidated, this needs to be reduced to be active, what can I do to that structure before it goes on the market to make sure that that doesn't happen? So a discussion with toxicologists and chemists, this is a way to go. And thinking a little bit further ahead into bringing this into the curriculum, when you're discussing in your classes hydroxylation, oxidation, pH, things like that, you can use examples taken from the literature to bring this home. Here's another example. This is just a very short list of known toxicophores. So these are structural features that are known to be toxic. Alpha beta unsaturated carbonyls. You see some examples there. The reaction mechanism is Michael addition, and it results in cancer, mutations, and others. Isocyanates that I talked about before. It's an addition reaction. So in your classes, when you're talking about Michael addition, or just general addition reactions, you can take the next step, use isocyanates as an example, and say, here are some of the endpoints that you need to consider when you're using these particular chemicals. Going down a little bit further into the Tox 21, using frontier molecular orbitals to predict toxicity, log P, melting points. Again, these are familiar to chemists, binding constants. So here are just some examples that can be used. And from a two-dimensional structure to very sophisticated models that are available on the website that I'll be giving you in a second here. But we can move this ahead by using tools that are available. Let me just go one more. So I just skipped ahead, just in the interest of time here. Getting back to the idea of risk and is equal to the hazard times the exposure. This is how we can look at the data generated from Tox 21 to make decisions about priority chemicals. You know, which ones there are 85,000 chemicals in commerce right now. About 300 have any toxicology data whatsoever. So if you look at the top graph, and I don't know if I have, right here, this is the hazard. This is the intrinsic hazard. And through the ToxCast database, these are data that were generated using in vitro assay systems. I'll explain that a little bit more in a second. But what you have here are Gaussian curves, and right here at this point here is the AC50. So that's the activation concentration 50%. And so you see that for several different chemicals on the top. On the bottom, there are programs available where you can estimate exposure. So we're getting back up here to hazard and exposure. And so for this chemical down here, you've got a normal distribution for exposure for a different population. You have one for this particular chemical and one for the third chemical. You can see from this that if this is the exposure and this is the hazard for this chemical, you really don't have to worry, because the exposure that you're estimating is nowhere near the point where it would be considered toxic. In here, we're getting a little bit closer. In here, you have to worry, because you're within the distributions of both the in vitro hazard and the exposure. So these are some of the things that are available through these high throughput and computational tools. And if you do write down anything at all and do visit any of the computational tools that we have available, I would suggest these two right here. These are EPA-generated databases, and the first one is called the ACTOR database, and it is a compilation of toxicology data, of structural data. There's also something called CPCAT, which is a division of the categories where you would find particular chemicals. So say, for example, you were looking at formaldehyde. It would give you a list of the different categories where formaldehyde can be found. So that's one. And the second one here, this should be CompTox. Forget that little P there. I apologize for the typo. But this is https comptox.epa.gov dashboard. And this is a new dashboard just launched in September. And you will find chemical physical data properties, toxicity exposure endpoints, and also links to the literature for each one of those endpoints. There are over 700,000 chemicals that you can examine on this particular website right here, CompTox. Again, I'm sorry. This was developed by a U.S. EPA employee, Anthony Williams, who also who came up with Chem Spider. So this is a very comprehensive database that is that can be used by anybody. It's freely downloadable. It is a public database. And so some other things along with toxicity that chemists need to be concerned with are also persistence, because that affects toxicity. How long does something stay in the environment? Does it bioaccumulate? Compounds that are very fat soluble build up in fatty tissue, and you will see it build up in the food chain as well. And so we need to think about the P, the B, and the T in what are called PBT criteria. So going up a little further beyond the specifics here, what do we mean with safer, healthier, and sustainable? We really need to understand what we're measuring and what the evaluation criteria are. Safer is relative, toxic is relative, and sustainability is a very difficult concept to define. And so we need to be asking questions along the entire life cycle of a chemical. Is it safer for what uses and for whom? For example, a pesticide is not safe for the pest that it's going after, but we need to ask the question, is it safe for human beings? Is it safe for the applicator? Or is it specific enough for the pests that we want to eliminate, or does it just eliminate other pests as well, non-target species? We need to examine the role of risk assessment in sustainability and also green chemistry. There are existing guidance documents, not only at EPA, but also with FDA and also international organizations. So again, when we're designing safer chemicals, when we're looking at sustainable, healthier chemicals, we also have to think about that it has to be effective, and it has to do what it is intended to do at a price that can be borne by the marketplace. So an example is of ideas where the right idea was done incorrectly are solar panels made using toxic solvents. Is that really economic and effective? We need to make sure we're doing the right things right. In disinfecting water supplies with chlorination, it results in chlorination byproducts. We need to think beyond that. So when you're thinking about this as a company, if you're developing a product, is the first call you want to make to your lawyer over here and ask what the regulations are, or do you want to call your chemist and just say, here's our issue, and what can we do to improve it? And I guess my suggestion is to call Linus Pauling, even though he passed away quite a number of years ago. So this is E.O. Wilson, and this is a dose of reality. A quote by E.O. Wilson is, "We are drowning in information while starving for wisdom. The world henceforth will be run by synthesizers, people able to put together the right information at the right time, think critically about it, and make important choices wisely." So we are at that point now with Tox 21, with the innovation that's going on in green chemistry, with all of the data that are being generated. Any of you brave souls who go on to ToxCast, who go on to the chemistry dashboard and look at the volume of data, individual data points that have been generated, it'll make your head spin. So what I'm advocating here is it might be time to take a break and start looking at the individual information that we're generating and start putting it into something we can use, synthesize that information for wisdom for the next generation. So green toxicology, toxicologists are and always have been linked as partners in adverse outcomes. So what we need to do is bring the toxicologists in earlier in the development of all chemicals. The new tools of toxicology, Tox 21, must be incorporated into the chemical design de novo. So they need to be brought in early. The conversations need to be substantive and just part of normal business. And again, this gets back to not just the discussions that we have in industry, in government. This needs to start in academia. Chemists need to be trained in the principles of toxicology. So what the Green Chemistry Commitment is doing is tremendous. And those of you who have been part of this discussion, I applaud you, because the only way that we can really comprehensively, holistically design the next generation of safer chemicals is to teach this not only in the colleges and universities, but also in the high schools and before that. And so the principles of toxicology need to be incorporated as seamlessly as possible. So thank you very much for the time, and I will yield. Thank you very much.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Nick. That was really inspirational. I think you gave us a lot of ideas for integrating and how we might start to think about bringing toxicology into our chemistry courses and vice versa. And so for anyone who has a question, please type it right into the question box on your control panel, and I will read them out to Nick as they come. I had a question to get us started. What are some ways that you, and you kind of answered this a little bit, and thank you for the plug at the end, by the way. What are some ways to help facilitate that discussion that you mentioned that quite a bit, the discussion and the communication between toxicologists and chemists? We often don't speak the same language. What are some ways of actually helping to facilitate that discussion and making that happen, more often?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the idea of, in academia, we have departments, we have, groups within departments. The same thing happens in government, and it also happens in industry. What we need to do is get more groups talking to each other that go beyond the discussion of, what kind of mass spectrometer do you have? Well, I have this kind of mass spectrometer, and not even bringing in the NMR people. So what we need to do is start talking, go down if you're in a university, for example, and you have a school of pharmacy, if you have a toxicology department, if you have a medical school that's working on toxicology endpoints, for example, Vanderbilt is one of the leading toxicology research centers, Johns Hopkins, Yale. As a chemist, go down and just kind of, make friends with the toxicologists down there and just, discuss. I realize that all of the adverse outcomes that we talk about with toxicity are based on chemical reactions. Yeah. Can you give me a couple of examples? And just start talking, informally sometimes, or augment that with webinars, with invited lectures. And what we also need to do is get the Society of Toxicology and the American Chemical Society to sponsor more joint conferences. It's being done now. It's getting better than it used to. But we need to just have those discussions at all levels of communication. And my recommendation is to just, speak on a very informal level.
Yeah, that's good. That's a great place to start. We had a question come in that's related to this discussion too. They say I completely agree with you on the lack of communication between chemists and toxicologists. The case of ionic liquids is a good example. Do you have any thoughts on that particular type of solvent?
On ionic liquids?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, ionic liquids. In general, ionic liquids, I think for a few years there, back in the 2000s, were thought of as the savior from from volatile solvents. You know, they weren't volatile, but they did the same. You know, they were alternatives to VOCs, which are toxic. Okay, we know they're toxic, but we also made the assumption was made that they must be a better alternative because they weren't VOCs and they weren't volatile. But that's not the case. What needed to be done was to include an examination of the toxicity of ionic liquids, because each ionic liquid is a different molecule, and different molecules have different toxicity profiles. So when you're using ionic liquids and you're saying, oh, gee, I'm going to use an ionic liquid as a replacement for a VOC because it's a green choice. It may be a green choice because it's not a VOC, but it might be much more toxic than the solvent you're replacing. So for ionic liquids, think about the toxicity of not only the molecule itself, but also the counter ion that's with it. That's going to affect the toxicity as well. So think about it more broadly. You know, in the 12 principles of green chemistry, think about principle number 4 as rigorously as the others.
Right. That's a great example of where some of those early communications and discussions would have really helped that.
Yeah.
I've got another question here for you. How involved are chemists in the initiatives at Tox 21, or are they involved?
Oh, they're very involved. Most of the, or I shouldn't say most, but a significant number of the contributors to the ComTox dashboard, which I misspelled, I apologize again, but the chemistry dashboard, the ComTox dashboard, and also what's called the DSS dashboard, which is the structural database, are chemists. And so the National Center for Computational Toxicology works very closely with chemists out of the Office of Research and Development. So there is a heavy presence of chemistry there. And if you look at the data that are available on those websites, there is a significant curation process with not only with structural fidelity, but also looking at making sure that compounds with similar but different names, like 1,2-dichlorobenzene versus orthodichlorobenzene, making sure that they match the CAS number. And so the QA and the QC that goes along with the DSS database, and that's the structural decision database, is very good. So there is quite a bit of interaction with the chemists and toxicologists.
That's fantastic. And we are coming up to the hour, so I'm going to close with one final question here for you. And our winner of a book is Emily Jarvis out at Loyola Marymount. So Emily will be sending you an email with your contact information. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed what you said, Nick, about the positive aspect of green chemistry is really about what you can do in opening up those opportunities for innovation. And I guess just a closing bigger picture question, how can we better use the tools of toxicology to foster innovation? I know it's kind of a broad one, and you've already touched upon a lot of the resources, but I think that innovation one is key. It's not just about all those other things. Also about it's a platform for innovation.
Yeah, and an example is if you go back, if you look at the slides, there's one slide where we have where I just gave just a few examples. There are hundreds of examples where a molecular structure, a toxicophore, is known, and it's known that certain, for example, azo dyes bind to DNA, and the actual mechanism of action is known. And so if toxicologists can say, I understand that this compound binds with DNA, but I don't know why, a chemist can look at that molecule and go deeper than a toxicologist can and say, well, what you have here is a nucleophile, And this is an electrophile. So all it is an SN1, SN2 reaction, for example, and all of a sudden a discussion breaks out, and the next question is, well, how can I stop this from happening? How can I reduce, make it a less functional nucleophile or a less functional electrophile through structural modification? And so, you know, the toxicologist doesn't have to know the big details, but the chemist does. And then, but the chemist doesn't have to know that it reacts with DNA, and then there's a whole series of things that happen to result in a tumor. But that discussion at the nexus, at the you know, the rub point of toxicology and chemistry needs to happen, and you start going deeper. So you start learning each other's language, and so language is important.
That's great. That's a great area. Great place to close this. So thank you so much, Nick, for this wonderful presentation and giving us some really great ideas. Thank you all for listening in on this webinar. All the recordings and supporting documents will be posted on that link you see. And also, Nick had mentioned that we do have a toxicology working group that Nick is involved with, where we're having this discussion on a regular basis. So if you'd like to join in on those, please send me an email. You're more than welcome to join in. And we're also identifying areas where we can develop some resources. So we'll be doing more of this in the future. We've got at the Green Chemistry and Engineering Conference, we have a Toxicology for Chemists symposium and workshop that we're coordinating at the ACS Green Chemistry and Engineering Conference next summer. So look for more information on that on our website, and also feel free to sign up for our quarterly newsletter and announcements through our web page as well to be notified about these things. So again, thank you so much. Thanks. One final thank you to Nick, and thanks so much for everyone for tuning in.
Thank you very much.